Believe it or not, you haven't seen this episode already, but we'd forgive you if it all feels a bit familiar. On October the 6th, 2025, the government of France collapsed after just barely 12 hours on the job. The country's new Prime Minister, former Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu, resigned practically without warning as his political rivals thundered about incoming votes of no confidence. The French economy buckled, political parties in the government's own coalition openly considered abandoning their allies, and some of France's newest government ministers were forced to give up their posts before they'd even been sworn in. And to be clear, your memory doesn't deceive you. France's last government collapsed less than a month ago, and the government before that had collapsed less than a year earlier. But now, any lingering hope that France could find its way out of its political crisis has evaporated, and rightly so. One way or the other, France cannot keep going on like this, and now it's not clear that the nation has any path forward that doesn't involve a complete political breakdown. Now, if you happen to be a regular viewer of Political Fronts, well, first of all, thank you so much and welcome back. Well, you might recall an episode that we published roughly a month ago under the title, Why Do French Governments Keep Collapsing? At that time, France was just a few days out from the dissolution of what had been its government at the time under career politician François Bayrou. At the time, France's path forward, it was hardly an easy one, but at least it had seemed rather straightforward. Bayrou and his cabinet would resign, French President Emmanuel Macron would choose a successor, that successor would choose a new government, and that new government would do its best to return France to a condition of normalcy. Of course, we now understand that last bit, the return to normalcy, just didn't really happen as planned. But while we're going to refer to that prior episode, if you'd like a deeper dive on why French governments are constantly collapsing, there are two pieces of key context to understand here. First, we need to understand the stunning division of modern French politics, and then we've got to understand why the last guy's government failed so spectacularly. Right now, the 577 seats of the French National Assembly are assigned based on the outcome of France's 2024 elections, a contest that, for all practical purposes, chopped the French government into thirds. On one side, there's a coalition of political parties led by the National Rally, a hard-right, firebrand political movement led by a name you've probably heard before, Marine Le Pen. On the other side, there's a coalition of parties collectively referred to as the New Popular Front, a leftist coalition ranging from relative centrists to hard leftist, eco-socialists, and even a handful of communists. Both the French left and the French right are orientated around the idea of populist reform to the French political system, even though their preferred visions for France couldn't be more wildly divergent. As such, they're both disinterested in forming any real compromise with the group in the middle, known collectively as Ensemble. Led and created by President Macron, Ensemble is the group that governs France today, although we've got to admit, saying that Ensemble actually governs France feels like a bit of a reach. As a whole, Ensemble is a centrist coalition made up of technocrats and leaders from the political establishment who are, in vibes, more of the stuffy bureaucratic type than the firebrands who can make politics so compelling for the masses. And if you know anything about France or about parliamentary systems in general, then you know that when a government is divided into nearly perfect thirds, then nobody has the parliamentary majority needed to govern unilaterally. The National Rally and the New Popular Front could, if they got together, form a majority coalition, but that is about as likely as America's hard-right Freedom Caucus and its hard-left legislators, the Squad, coming together and forming the strangest political party of all time. Instead, the National Rally and the New Popular Front sit on the sidelines while Macron's minority runs the show, and usually there are at least some ways to manage that situation. If the ruling coalition has to get something passed, it can lean on either the right wing or the left wing by making concessions, thus allowing one of the two sides to participate in responsible governance while also allowing the other side to grandstand and score political points with their base. It's not a comfortable system, and it certainly isn't easy for the centrists, but at the very least, it can work most of the time. Fast forward to last month, however, and France's then Prime Minister François Bayrou learns a lesson the hard way. There's some legislation, no matter the circumstances or the needs, that neither the French left nor the French right will ever get behind. Right now, France is in genuine financial trouble. The nation is racking up debt. Its economy isn't doing very well, and there's even some talk that it could require intervention from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which would be a very troubling sign from one of Europe's largest economies. To try and right the ship, Bayrou had proposed a new budget that would have cut back in a lot of areas, draw down spending on areas deemed non-essential, and otherwise tightened Paris's belt to get ahead of the issue. The problem, however, was that in order to get the budget passed, Bayrou needed either the populist National Rally or the populist New Popular Front, and no self-respecting politician anywhere in the world would ever think of voting for the types of cuts that Bayrou had put forward. Although this wasn't the most important cut, the one that really caught the public's attention and really makes it clear why the populists couldn't get on board would have eliminated multiple national holidays. Suffice it to say, the measure failed spectacularly to draw the support Bayrou needed, and despite Bayrou trying to raise alarms over just how serious the situation is, he was thrown out of office by way of a confidence vote that he had chosen to call for. He was the fourth French Prime Minister to be ousted from his seat in a span of less than 2 years. With that backstory in mind, it probably shouldn't have been a surprise that Macron chose to play it safe with his next choice in PM. Despite calls for him to resign or to start the process to initiate a new set of national elections, Macron chose to maintain the status quo and elevate a loyalist to implement what Macron considered to be a more thought-out approach to national leadership. His choice was 39-year-old Sébastien Lecornu, who had been serving until that time as Macron's Minister of the Armed Forces. In contrast to Bayrou, who leads his own centrist party and basically strong-armed his way into the Prime Minister's role, Lecornu was thought to be a much safer choice, one who would reassure the public and thread the needle between financial austerity and changes that France could actually get behind. And at least for a couple of weeks, it seemed as if Lecornu was on a track to do just that. A few days after he was appointed Prime Minister, he told the French press that he would no longer... The French press is like a coffee maker. That he would no longer seek to abolish the 2 public holidays that Bayrou had targeted, and over the course of the following weeks, he made clear that he was going to shift his focus toward cuts to the benefits and tax breaks of the rich, including former prime ministers who, until now, have received lifelong benefits after leaving office. But although Lecornu stepped up to the role of prime minister in early September, a prime minister alone doesn't make a government. Instead, it was Lecornu's job to assemble a cabinet of ministers and bring together the sorts of leaders and policymakers who could lead France until the next legislative election, scheduled for no later than 2029, but probably called after France elects a new president in 2027. And when Lecornu unveiled his government on the 5th of October 2025, the reaction from the French people was beyond bad. Lecornu hadn't just elevated a couple of controversial leaders, he had kept almost the entire collection of ministers from the last government in place to try and build his new one. Less than a month after the National Assembly had voted those ministers out of a job with decisive margins and an explicit vote of no confidence, there they were again, elevated to the same positions in which they'd had months to succeed previously and had instead failed miserably to improve the lot of ordinary people. Not only that, but Lecornu's decision to bring them back flew directly in the face of promises that he had made while he was already the Prime Minister. Just a few weeks ago, Lecornu had been promising what he called a, quote, rupture with the prior government and pledging to overhaul the country's leadership. In reality, Lecornu was nothing if not an equal opportunity offender, and his new choice of cabinet had something for everybody to hate. Both the far left and the far right were outraged at the return of Bruno Le Maire, who had been chosen by Lecornu to serve as the new defense minister. Until about a year ago, Le Maire had been the country's finance minister for more than half a decade, and it was Le Maire, according to much of the National Assembly, that was responsible for France's current financial predicament. The new Minister of Justice had been credibly accused of corruption barely a year ago. The new Minister of Culture had been under investigation for years. The vast majority of the new cabinet members were longtime leaders who had frustrated and disappointed the French public in one way or another, and the few new arrivals were all relatively inexperienced and sourced from Lecornu's own inner circle. The response was pure outrage. Lecornu's pick for Interior Minister, Bruno Retailleau, expressed his intense opposition to the new cabinet, of which he himself was a new member, and called it out for not representing the proper break with prior governments that Lecornu had promised. Far-left and far-right leaders managed to unite in calling the new government a middle finger to the French people, while various party leaders pitched in helpful adjectives like pathetic, incompetent, contemptuous, joke, farce, and all sorts of other things that typically a political leader would like to avoid when the people around them are describing their newly formed government. In essence, Lecornu's choice of ministers wasn't just a miscalculation, it was taken as a deliberate slap in the face to the French people. The National Assembly made clear that it was highly unlikely to approve the ministers Lecornu had chosen, and members of Macron's own centrist coalition made clear that they would oppose Lecornu if things got that far. By the following day, Lecornu had observed the writing on the wall and chose to resign and end his own government. In an address that blamed his resignation on the partisanship of his fellow legislators, Lecornu didn't appear to agree with the rationale behind their disagreement, but did seem to understand that there was no way out of such an obvious political dumpster fire. With a tenure of just 27 days as Prime Minister, Lecornu claimed the dubious record of the shortest premiership in the history of the French Fifth Republic. His larger government broke an even more impressive record, becoming not just the shortest-lived government in the Fifth Republic, but in all of French history. They preserved, despite tremendous opposition, for a brave, bold span of 14 hours before raising the white flag. Okay, so in the very near term, the French government's next moves have already been decided. Lecornu will stick around in a caretaker role, in the typical custom for resigned prime ministers, until a replacement can be identified to claim his position. His ministers are expected to do the same, presiding over the day-to-day business of their offices, but not taking any action that would substantively impact government policy or programs. Lecornu has been given 48 hours by Macron to try and negotiate a recovery of his political position, but right now that effort appears to be doomed to failure. Barring any larger upheaval, President Macron will be charged with identifying a new prime minister, and then it'll be that prime minister's job to choose a new cabinet. If Macron does pursue that path forward, then his new prime minister will have a very difficult needle to thread. There aren't that many high-profile leaders in and around the French government, and certainly not an unlimited amount within Macron's political coalition. A new PM would have to identify no fewer than 18 people who are distant enough from past governments to be satisfactory, but also non-controversial enough that they wouldn't be forcefully opposed, and also qualified and knowledgeable enough to dig France out of its current financial predicament. One potential fix could be to reach outside French politics, appointing experts and technocrats to relevant roles, acclaimed economists to economic and financial positions, civil leaders to labor and advocacy positions, etc. While that sort of cabinet probably wouldn't get the people of France very excited, it might be a more palatable alternative, relying on stuffy bureaucrats who don't make trouble and have, through their other work, earned enough trust that they could come in as outsiders and attempt to right the ship. Or Macron could try and elevate a new prime minister from the left, although a government led by France's socialist wing would be unlikely to last very long. But right now, it's not clear that Macron and a new prime minister could even get that far. For one thing, Macron's ensemble coalition relies on the support of a bloc called the Republicans, which votes alongside ensemble most of the time, but has very pointedly refused to join the coalition. Right now, the Republicans control 39 seats in the National Assembly, about 6.5% of the overall body, and when the Macron government is trying to lead from a minority position, those 39 votes are really important. The relationship between Macron and the Republicans had already been fraying before the newest cabinet was announced, and their leader, Bruno Retailleau, was the person we'd mentioned before, who railed against the new cabinet despite having been chosen for the post of Interior Minister. At this point, he and his party may have more to gain by siding with the opposition and working to force Macron's hand in attempting the nuclear option, a call for new elections, and potentially even a resignation. Macron is in a very difficult political situation, not just because of the three-way split in the current government, but because it's all but assured that in the next set of elections, his ensemble coalition is going to be punished relentlessly by French voters. It's not clear how bad the massacre is going to be, but after years in which Macron and his various governments have failed to deliver for the French people, support for the opposition and outrage toward Macron are at an all-time high. The National Rally and the New Popular Front are both expected to cash in, swelling their ranks with National Assembly seats that will have been torn from Macron's coalition. Now, by abandoning Macron at a moment of incredibly poor public opinion, the Republicans and other smaller parties could stand to benefit as well. And if the smaller parties abandon Macron outright, then France may have no choice but to head into a new election cycle. Essentially, Macron is trying to handle a political time bomb, and whenever the clock runs out, he and his coalition are going to suffer tremendous consequences. Macron has tried to call voters' bluff before, like he did in 2024 when he called a series of snap elections, but back then, voters delivered the three-way split that Macron is now dealing with. Between that bruising experience and the fact that the situation has gotten even worse for him, Macron certainly doesn't want to call for new elections, but it may be better than the alternative. If Macron takes that step now, the results will be very bad, but they will not be quite as bad as they would be if Macron sticks with the current National Assembly through the end of his term. A 2-year delay means 2 more years of paralysis, government collapses, and disappointment in Macron and his coalition, probably driving even more people to the hard left or the hard right. Call for a vote now, and Macron may be able to mitigate some of the damage, but he'd also be throwing away any real chance to govern the way that he wants to between now and the end of his term. If Macron does choose to call a new set of elections, he's going to get the support of his political rivals. The National Rally and the New Popular Front have both called for voters to go to the polls, eagerly anticipating a swell in support. Macron is now authorized to call elections legally, since it's now been more than a year since the last set of snap elections. If Macron could figure out a way to promise a PM and cabinet that voters will actually like, he could attempt to use this as a way to bring some voters back onto his side. And if he doesn't, then the economic costs could be dire. Within hours of the collapse of the Lecornu government, French stocks had taken a nosedive, and so did the value of the euro. Market experts suggest that the problem isn't just the collapse of the new government, but the lack of any perceived way out of France's predicament. Call a new election, and there's at least a bit of hope, even if the job of governing afterward will be very, very difficult. And of course, there's the true nuclear option in all of this for Macron himself to resign, prompting the rise of an interim president and the scheduling of a nationwide presidential election within 50 days. This has only happened once before in France when Charles de Gaulle resigned in 1969, and it's a step that Macron has been very hesitant to take. He's committed to seeing out the end of his term in 2027, and he's reiterated that pledge in the past, despite calls from both sides of the aisle for him to resign after the failures of prior governments. Now, though, Macron's calculus may have changed for the worse. It's entirely possible that Macron doesn't see a way out of the current situation, doesn't believe that a technocratic government will be enough, and doesn't believe that there's any way to salvage the National Assembly through a snap legislative election. Choose to resign his post, force the French people to decide on a single new president instead of hundreds of legislatures, and Macron may hope that he could prompt voters to choose what he would describe as a responsible leader instead of a firebrand from either end of the political spectrum. His protege, 35-year-old Gabriel Attal, is fairly well liked in France despite having led a failed government of his own, and there's some chance that Attal could win a snap election, especially since the National Rally would elevate young Jordan Bardella instead of the more familiar Marine Le Pen. For Macron to pin his hopes on a presidential election would be a hell of a gamble, but if nothing else, Macron is a gambler, and if he can get a chosen successor into the presidency, that successor can make the case for the political center in a new series of elections. It's not a great option by any stretch, but it might be the one that Macron feels driven to choose. Either way, one thing is certain. The political crisis that's ravaged France over the last several years isn't getting better. If it was, then the latest government would have lasted longer than 14 hours before having to resign. Where France goes next, nobody knows for sure, but the status quo in Paris, it cannot hold. Thank you for watching.